Nogales, Arizona, the autumn of 1963. A Saturday morning at the Nogales Livestock Association grounds on the eastern edge of town, a mile from the international fence that divided this part of the Sonoran Desert into two countries that had been arguing about the line since 1853, and that had, in the century since, developed the specific border town economy and culture that emerges when two countries share a fence line long enough that the fence becomes less a division than a meeting point. The livestock grounds occupied 4 acres of the Santa Cruz River floodplain, with a main arena, 3 holding pens, a tack shed, a water trough system that had been replumbed in 1958, and a set of portable bleachers that could hold 300 people when all sections were deployed, and that held, on this particular Saturday morning, approximately 140. The occasion was the annual Working Horse and Cattle Exhibition put on by the Nogales Livestock Association, an event that the association had been running for 29 years, and that had, in those 29 years, developed the specific reputation that serious regional exhibitions develop when they are run by people who care about the standards and are willing to enforce them, which is the reputation of an event where the work is real and the judgment is honest, and the people who compete in it do so because the competition means something to them, rather than because the prize money is significant, which it was not. An event that had been running since 1934 and that served the specific function in the southern Arizona cattle community of a place where the working skills of the industry could be demonstrated and judged by people who understood what they were watching. Not a rodeo, which was a performance for a general audience. An exhibition, which was a demonstration for people who already knew what a well-thrown loop looked like, and what it meant when the catch was clean, and what it meant when it was not. The ranchers and the cowboys and the hired men who competed in these exhibitions were not performing. They were being evaluated by peers who had spent their lives developing the same skills and who applied to the evaluation the specific unsparing judgment of experts watching other experts work. The crowd in the portable bleachers was that kind of crowd. They had come from ranches and from the town, and from as far as Sonoita and Patagonia, and a few from across the line in Sonora, because livestock people on both sides of the Santa Cruz Valley understood that the Nogales Livestock Association exhibition was where serious work was demonstrated and evaluated, and that watching it told you things about the current state of working ranch skills in the region that you could not learn from any other source. They were drinking coffee from paper cups and talking to each other in the way that people talk at events they attend regularly with the same people, which is with the comfortable shorthand of long acquaintance. John Wayne had been in Nogales since Thursday on work related to a film that was in pre-production and that had sent him to the border country south of Tucson because the director wanted to shoot in terrain that had not been used by the studios extensively and that had the specific character of the Sonoran border country, which was different from the character of the high desert further north, and which required someone who knew what he was looking at to evaluate whether it would serve the story. He had been driving the border road since Thursday morning with a location scout and a production designer, and had found 3 locations worth considering, and had spent Friday and part of Saturday morning dealing with the logistics of access and permits and the other practical questions that location scouting in a working ranching area requires. And that required location scouting in the border country south of Tucson. He was 55 years old. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall and 255 pounds, and he had been involved with the Western film industry for 35 years, and had, in those 35 years, learned to ride well enough that the riding required for film work did not require a double, and had developed, in addition to the riding, a specific interest in the working skills of actual ranch work that was different from the interest he had in it for professional purposes. He had been practicing roping since 1958, which was the year he had watched a working cowboy on a location shoot in New Mexico catch a steer in 6 seconds on the first throw, and had understood, with the specific understanding of a man who can recognize when someone is doing something real as opposed to something performed, that what he had been doing with a rope in film work for 30 years was not the same thing and had never been. He had found a trainer in the San Fernando Valley who worked with real rope horses and real cattle, and who had agreed, for reasons that included but were not limited to the financial ones, to teach Wayne what he knew. He had been practicing roping since 1958, in the same private, unannounced way that he had been practicing karate, and that he practiced anything that interested him, and that required sustained physical effort to do well. He practiced at his property in Encino, twice a week, with an old rope horse that his trainer had selected for patience and a practice steer dummy that his trainer had built from pipe and rope and a stuffed canvas head. He had been doing this for 5 years. He had never roped at an exhibition. He had never roped in front of anyone who knew what roping was. The livestock exhibition had been in its 3rd event of the morning when a man named Curtis Sloane, who was the secretary of the Nogales Livestock Association, and who had recognized Wayne on Thursday when he came through the grounds during the location scouting, and had spoken with him briefly, and established that Wayne had an interest in the exhibition, stopped him at the fence rail and said that one of the competitors in the open roping event had withdrawn due to a pulled shoulder, and asked if Wayne would like to fill the slot. He said it in the offhand way of a man who did not expect the answer to be yes, and was asking as a courtesy rather than a genuine invitation. The conversation at the fence rail had been overheard. This was not an unusual thing at a livestock exhibition, where the bleachers were close to the working area, and voices carried in the still morning air. What was unusual was the specific content of what was overheard, which was the secretary of the Nogales Livestock Association asking John Wayne if he wanted to rope a steer in the open competition, and the people in the nearest section of the bleachers who had heard it had the specific reaction that people have when they hear something that produces 2 simultaneous and contradictory responses, which was amusement and interest. 3 men in the front row of the nearest section were ranchers from the Santa Cruz Valley who had been running cattle for a combined total of 91 years. The youngest of them had been working cattle since 1937, and the oldest since 1924, and between them they had watched more roping than they could accurately count, and had developed, through the watching, the specific expertise of people who have seen the full range of what a skill looks like at every level from beginner to master, and who can place any demonstration on that range within the first 30 seconds of watching it. They had watched the morning's roping with the expert attention of 91 combined years of understanding what they were watching. One of them, a man named Frank Orosco, who was 63 years old and had been a member of the Nogales Livestock Association since 1938, said to the man beside him, at a volume that carried to the fence rail, that an actor who had been throwing rope at a dummy in a Los Angeles backyard was going to have a different experience with a live steer in a working arena in front of people who knew the difference. He said it without particular malice and without lowering his voice to make it a private observation. He said it in the matter-of-fact tone of a man stating a technical observation that he believed to be accurate. The two men beside him made sounds that were not disagreement. John Wayne heard it. Curtis Sloane heard it. They were 4 feet from the fence rail. The morning was still, and sounds carried. Wayne looked at Frank Orosco in the front row of the bleachers. He said that he appreciated the observation. He said it in the flat, direct tone he used for things he meant. He said that he would take the slot if it was available. Curtis Sloane said it was available. Wayne said he would need a horse. Sloane said there was a ranch horse available from one of the morning's competitors, whose own horse had gone lame the previous evening, and who had borrowed another man's horse for his runs, and whose horse was standing in the tack shed with a good mouth and no particular objections to strangers. Wayne said that would work. He had 22 minutes between the conversation at the fence rail and his slot in the program. He spent 12 of them with the horse, whose name was Cobra, and whose name he had been told by Curtis Sloane, along with the information that Cobra was 12 years old and had been a working ranch horse since he was 4, and had been used for roping for the previous 6 years by a rancher named Pablo Gutierrez, who ran cattle on 4,000 acres in the Altar Valley, and who was in the bleachers that morning watching with the specific attention of a man whose horse is carrying a stranger, and who wants to see what the stranger does with him. Wayne introduced himself to Cobra in the tack shed with his hands before anything else, the way you introduce yourself to a horse that does not know you and that you are going to need to work with in 12 minutes, and who was a 12-year-old bay gelding with the specific quiet competence of a ranch horse that had been doing this work for 8 years and had no strong opinions about who was on his back, as long as the person on his back was not making decisions that contradicted what the horse already knew about roping. Wayne spent 12 minutes getting acquainted with Cobra in the specific way that a man who knows horses gets acquainted with one he has not ridden before, which is with his hands and his weight and his attention rather than with his voice, because horses do not learn about riders from what riders say, and learn a great deal about riders from how riders sit. He spent the remaining 10 minutes watching the 2 competitors who went before him from the chute end of the arena, which was a different vantage point from the bleacher vantage point, and which showed him things about the cattle and the horses, and the geometry of the catches that the bleacher vantage point would not have shown. He watched the way the cattle came out of the chute at the specific speed of cattle who have done this before and know what is about to happen, and are going to make it as difficult as their speed and their instincts allow. He watched the way the horses read the cattle, and how much of the roping was the horse rather than the rider, which was more than most of the people in the bleachers understood, and which Cobra, standing in the tack shed with his 8 years of this work in his body, already knew from the chute end of the arena, watching the way the cattle came out of the chute, and the distance at which the horses settled, and the specific adjustments the ropers made to the angle of the swing, depending on how the steer was running. Frank Orosco in the front row of the bleachers watched the same 2 competitors, and then watched the man with the rope going through his warm-up swings behind the chute and said nothing further. He watched with the complete attention that his 91 combined years of watching made possible. The steer came out of the chute at 9:47. It was a 3-year-old Santa Gertrudis cross, 740 pounds, that came out running straight and then cut left at the 6-second mark in the specific way that cattle cut when they are not going to make the roping easy. Cobra cut with it without being asked. the way a good rope horse cuts, which is by reading the steer's movement a half second before the movement is complete and being in the right position when it completes. The horse had been doing this for 8 years and did not need to be told what the steer was doing. What the horse needed from the man on his back was to not be told the wrong thing, to not be overcorrected or second-guessed at the moment when the horse's 8 years of knowledge was the most reliable information available. Wayne gave the horse that. He had been sitting on ranch horses for 35 years, and he understood what a working horse needed from a rider, which was presence and balance, and the specific absence of interference at the critical moment. Wayne swung twice and threw on the second swing at a distance of 18 feet, which was not the distance at which the morning's best ropers had been catching, but which was the distance at which the angle was right and the horse was settled, and the throw was going to land where the throw needed to land. The loop settled over the steer's head and tightened when Cobra backed and set his feet, and the rope went straight, and the steer stopped. The time was 9.4 seconds. It was not the fastest time of the morning. It was the 4th time of 7 competitors. Frank Orosco in the front row of the bleachers looked at the arena. He had been watching roping at this exhibition for 25 years. He understood what 9.4 seconds on a left-cutting steer meant for a man who had been roping for 5 years on a horse he had never ridden. He looked at the man on the bay horse and said nothing for a moment. Then he said to the man beside him, at a volume that no longer carried to the fence rail. He said to the man beside him, at a volume that no longer carried to the fence rail. Because Wayne was in the arena and the distance was greater, that he had been wrong about the backyard. He said it in the same matter-of-fact tone he had used for the original observation. Because a man who states technical observations accurately when the observations go against the subject should state them accurately when they go in the subject's favor. And Frank Orosco was that kind of man. After the event, Wayne returned Cobra to the tack shed and unsaddled him and rubbed him down and left him with fresh water and hay. He found Curtis Sloane near the secretary's table and thanked him for the slot and for the horse and for the 10 minutes at the shoot end of the arena that had been worth more than he had expected. He did not speak to Frank Orosco, and he did not look at him as he walked from the arena back to the tack shed, and he did not acknowledge in any way that he had heard what Orosco said after the run, or that he knew Orosco had been the one to say it before the run. This was not because he was indifferent to what had been said. It was because the correction that mattered had been made in the place where it needed to be made, and making it again by walking over to the front row of the bleachers and acknowledging it directly would have turned it into something it was not. He had heard what Orosco said after the run, in the same way he had heard what Orosco said before it, because voices carried in the still morning air, and a man who pays attention hears what the air carries. He did not need Orosco's correction acknowledged to him directly. The correction had been made in the arena, in front of the people who were qualified to evaluate it, which was where corrections of that kind belonged and where they carried the weight they deserved.